As one of the early European explorers in Western Australia, John Septimus Roe was responsible for naming many towns and features in WA. You'll see his name mentioned a lot on our website. We think it's fitting that our first video biography is of the man who was responsible for the discovery of much of Western Australia. He was born in Berkshire, England on May 8, 1797, and was the seventh son of Reverend James Roe and Sophia Brooks. He came from a poor but respectable family and was educated at Christ's Hospital School. It was noted for strict discipline and very Spartan conditions. Roe wrote home to his parents often, and he continued this habit and became a meticulous diarist later in life. In one letter he wrote, "In the summer, we get up at 6 o'clock, make our beds and wash. We have bread and beer for breakfast, and sometimes a piece of cheese from the night before. We go into school at 7 o'clock, come out at 11 o'clock, lunch is at 12, then school from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. There is pea soup called hogwash, and much disliked by the boys." During his time at the school, Roe almost made the decision to change from a mathematical and navigational education to a more arts-based one. But his father would not hear of it, and so young John was set on a course that would eventually lead him to the other side of the world. He did well at school and entered service in the Royal Navy at the age of 16 in May 1813. He was a midshipman aboard the HMS Ripon. He served on the Ripon during the Napoleonic Wars and saw action several times. Next he served aboard HMS Horatio, first on convoy duty, then on surveying. During a survey, the ship struck rocks and was almost lost. But Roe seems to have had a charmed life, and this was the first of a number of lucky escapes over the years. He then sailed for China in July 1815, going via the Cape of Good Hope, and returned to England in January 1817. Roe was now made master's mate, and he boarded the ship Dick and travelled to New South Wales, joining the surveying service, where he served with Philip Parker King. After a time in Sydney, when he almost drowned during a boating accident, the expedition was provided with the ship Mermaid, on which they set sail on December the 21st, 1817. Travelling down the New South Wales coast, they then went west through Bass Strait, continued on, and eventually dropped anchor at King George Sound. During his stay in that area, Roe travelled around Oyster Harbour, crossing the King and Calgan rivers, and once again his luck held, and he just avoided drowning again. The survey moved on up the west coast to the northwest Cape, and then turned east along the north of Australia and through Torres Strait. On returning to Sydney, Roe surveyed the Derwent River, before rejoining King and sailing north for more survey work. This survey was cut short, and the ship returned to Sydney before returning north again to complete the work. It was during this trip that Roe was attacked by a group of Aborigines, and again escaped more by good luck than anything else. The Mermaid was by now in need of major repairs, and was beached on what became known as Careening Bay. After being patched up, they sailed back to Sydney, and were almost lost in a storm on the way. On arrival, the Mermaid was pronounced unfit for sea duty, and the survey transferred to the Bathurst. In May 1821, they sailed once again to the west coast, and it was during this voyage that Roe fell 50 feet from the head of the mast and escaped death only because some temporary planks had been placed in a position to break his fall. He later attributed this fall to the loss of sight in his right eye later in life. The survey went as far as Roebuck Bay, before sailing to Mauritius and then returning south to King George Sound, and finally back to the east coast again. In 1823, Roe was promoted to lieutenant, and during the stop-off in Sydney, he surveyed the harbour, where once again he was involved in an accident, where a boat overturned and 4 sailors drowned. Fate smiled on him yet again, and he survived, making it to shore with the rest of the crew. After a refit, the Bathurst and Roe set sail for England on May 10, 1823. In 1824, he joined the HMS Tamar under Captain James Gordon Bremer. In September 1824, with the ships Countess of Harcourt and Lady Nelson, a group of settlers were taken to Melville Island, where the ill-fated Fort Dundas was established. With the settlers dropped off and left to their fate, the Tamar sailed for Bombay and more survey work. After returning to England, Roe met James Stirling and was soon asked to join the expedition taking settlers to the Swan River colony. Initially, Roe and Stirling did not get on very well personally, but eventually they went on to work very well together. Roe received his appointment in writing before even Stirling, and he was the first official appointee of the new colony. He was initially given 2 years' leave from the Navy, but this was later extended all the way out to 40 years. Before leaving England, Roe married Matilda Bennett, who would follow him to the new colony and eventually bear him 13 children in all. Roe arrived in WA in 1829 as Surveyor General, a post that he was initially meant to fill for just 2 years. 40 years later, and at least 16 expeditions completed, Roe had travelled the length and breadth of the state. He is one of the most inspirational of our early explorers, only retiring in 1871. Roe's initial work in WA was almost impossible. With just one sickly assistant, he was expected to lay out the town sites of Perth and Fremantle, while at the same time survey properties for all the settlers who had made claims for land grants. Invariably there were some mistakes, and for very many years afterwards Roe was involved in protracted boundary disputes between the landowners. Apart from being Surveyor General, Roe served as a magistrate, as a member of the Legislative Council, as a director of the West Australian Bank, a member of the Board of Surveys, president of the Swan River Mechanics Institute, a committee member investigating the establishment of a railway east of Perth, a member of a board designating the responsibilities of harbour masters, as Register of Brands, and of Commissioner of Roads and Bridges. From 1830 to 1848 he led at least 16 expeditions all over WA. His work was to inspire later explorers like John and Alexander Forrest, as well as the Gregory brothers, all of whom worked with Roe at one time or another. Roe was a member of a party of settlers who took part in the Battle of Pinjarra in October 1834, but he refused to fire on the group of Aborigines himself. By 1859, Roe wanted a break, and it's little wonder. He applied for 18 months' leave, during which he took his wife and 3 youngest children back to England, where he visited friends and relatives and even paid a long visit to James Stirling. The family returned to WA in September 1861. Roe did not enjoy the voyage home, and wrote of it being a most protracted and disagreeable passage. His wife Matilda died in 1870, and Roe was bereft. He never really recovered from her loss, and although he was formally to retire the following year, and lived a further 7 years, his health gradually deteriorated and he became frail and infirm. He died on May 28, 1878, having raised no less than 13 children with his wife Matilda. Roe has been accused by some historians of feathering his own nest, making sure his own properties were selected and surveyed before others. He was also accused of being an autocrat, a member of a social elite who wanted the landed gentry to keep control and opposed any moves towards establishing representative government. Even if some of these accusations were true, many of these things were merely a reflection of the times and his background. Most gentlemen settlers held the same views. But Roe contributed so much to the early development of the colony that it's fitting that he is remembered more for his tireless efforts than for his opinions. The accusations were refuted by his obituary in the Perth Inquirer and Commercial News that stated, "His hands were clean. He never used the privileges of his post unduly to his own advantage or the advancement of his numerous family." Many of his personal papers display a genuine concern for other people of all walks of life, and he was known to be a fair and honest man in his dealings with others. Writing about exploration in 1840, an unknown author penned the following: "There have been almost continuous explorations from Perth this year. The first of the colonies to wake up to the importance of examining the interior was, as usual, the indefatigable colony of Western Australia. High on the roll of honour of WA explorers is the name of John Septimus Roe, father of Western Australian explorers. John Septimus Roe and Matilda Bennett have been immortalised in a number of place and street names around the state. Roeburn, Roe Highway, Roe Street, Matilda Bay, Mount Matilda, Bennett Street, and many others commemorate the remarkable contribution that John made to the development of Western Australia." One of the last entries John made in his diary before he retired was the rather understated comment, "I have not been an idle man in my generation."